Point to any random spot in Eastern Europe, and you're bound to find a town or a village or a city with a savage history. The town of Tilsit, today Sovetsk, is no exception. If in the 19th century you were to start at the mouth of the Nemunas or Niemen River and trace it east through Lithuania, you would find Tilsit, a modest Germanic town about 120 kilometers northeast of Königsberg. Possession of Tilsit changed hands many times throughout its early history. Poland wrested control of the town and its castle from the Teutonic Knights, who themselves conquered it from the native Prussians and Lithuanians. During the many wars between Poland and Sweden and Russia, the town was occupied and fought over. Eventually the Kingdom of Prussia took control of its eponymous province, Tilsit along with it. Without having moved an inch, Tilsit found itself on Prussia's eastern border with Russia, and playing host to Russian armies, first as invaders, and now more recently as allies. In June of 1807, Tilsit once again found itself under foreign occupation, this time by French soldiers of La Grande Armée. After decisively crushing the Russian army at the Battle of Friedland, Emperor Napoleon advanced to cover the crossings of the Niemen. There was an understanding that after such a lopsided victory, peace could not be far behind. Napoleon didn't have to wait long. On June 19th, Prince Dmitry Lobanov-Rostovsky crossed the Niemen to petition for an armistice. After some haggling about the terms and allowing time for straggling units to reach their cause, Napoleon accepted Lobanov-Rostovsky's armistice on June 21st. All that remained was to make good the peace with a binding treaty. But before we delve into the subsequent Treaty of Tilsit, we need some more context. To understand the implications of this watershed moment of the Napoleonic era, we must have a solid understanding of what France and Russia, of what Emperor Napoleon and Tsar Alexander hoped to gain at the negotiating table. We'll start with what we know. For Napoleon, nothing was more important than defeating Britain, and to do that, he sought to expand his continental system into those corners of Europe not already encompassed by the Berlin Decrees. That meant, in the main, Prussia, Russia, and Scandinavia. On paper, this ought to be easy, as Napoleon had decisively defeated all his foes. French victory over Prussia was total. The domain of the fugitive King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm III, reduced to Königsberg and its surrounds. Tsar Alexander's intervention on Friedrich's behalf had also backfired spectacularly, with defeat at the Battle of Friedland. And finally, Gustav IV, King of Sweden, had backed the wrong horse, aiding Sweden's old enemy Russia, only to be ejected from Pomerania for his troubles. Despite the relative weakness of his enemies, Napoleon's position was only strong strategically. Diplomatically, he was as isolated as ever. Ultimately, the members of the Fourth Coalition remained united in opposition to French hegemony in Europe. Thus, if Napoleon was to impose the continental system, he would have to walk a diplomatic tightrope, simultaneously striking a conciliatory tone without appearing weak, and also maintaining an aura of strength without appearing overbearing. The strategy Napoleon devised to overcome the coalition was not unlike one of his battle plans: identify weaknesses in the enemy's line and exploit them. Here he identified Russia as the linchpin of the coalition's strength and unity. Sweden and Prussia were reduced to irrelevance by their crippling military defeats, and Britain was unable to strike directly at France without a reliable continental ally. The moment he'd intervened to bail out King Friedrich, Tsar Alexander was the de facto leader of the Fourth Coalition. Even now, despite heavy defeat at Friedland and the ongoing war with the Ottoman and Persian empires, the last reserves of the Russian army were amassing east of Poland. The Tsar did not lack the capacity to fight on should he choose, he lacked only the willingness. Pinning down just who Tsar Alexander Romanov was, or what he believed, is a tough one. Throughout his career, he would oscillate from staunch arch-conservatism to forthright liberalism. After assuming the throne in 1801 after the assassination of his father, Tsar Paul I, Alexander had experimented with some liberalish domestic reforms, but in terms of foreign policy had scarcely deviated from the course set by his father, maintained the European status quo. This meant opposing the rise of a post-revolutionary France under its upstart emperor, and explains Alexander's adherence to its alliance with Austria in 1805 during the War of the Third Coalition. That alliance had of course led the Tsar to suffer a grave defeat at Austerlitz, but it was a setback that did not fundamentally alter his diplomatic position. France, Napoleon really, remained a threat, a distant one to be sure, but a threat nonetheless. This assessment seemed to be on the mark as Napoleon expanded French dominion into Germany, where Russia had long-standing dynastic and political ties. Later, the French allied with the Ottoman Empire and stoked the flames of war in the Balkans. So it wasn't a hard sell for Alexander to intervene in the War of the Fourth Coalition, certain that the combination of Russian and Prussian arms would be insurmountable even for the lauded Grande Armée. Even after Prussia's defeat at Jena and the narrow loss at Eylau, the Tsar remained confident in the coalition. That faith was tested, however, by a secret treaty signed on April 26, 1807, between the members of the coalition, meant to formalise their alliance. Committed as ever to the status quo, Alexander demanded no compensation for Russia, only that the French Empire be allowed to retain their possessions in Italy and Holland in exchange for a restoration of the borders of Austria and Prussia. These terms Alexander felt were more than reasonable, but even in their pitifully weak state, the Prussians would not accept a return to normal. Count von Hardenberg of the original Prussian pro-war camp fancied Prussia annexing swaths of territory from the Confederation of the Rhine. Britain backed Hardenberg in exchange for a promised return of Hanover. Outmaneuvered, the Tsar's peace plan was rejected. He'd realised only too late that despite being the bedrock of the coalition's martial might, he was still regarded as a junior partner. Disillusioned by his allies and thoroughly beaten at Friedland, Tsar Alexander took a long, hard look at his policy and reassessed his opposition to France. So far the war had brought only catastrophe and further aligned Russia with untrustworthy allies. All disputes put on ice for the good of the alliance now flared up. Sweden, for instance, earned the Tsar's ire as they'd stolen £80,000 destined for Russian coffers. They'd also failed to provide adequate support during the siege of Danzig and generally proven to be opportunistic and uncooperative. Exacerbating tensions were unresolved territorial disputes around Sweden's possession of Finland, right on St. Petersburg's doorstep. The sheen had worn off of the alliance with Prussia too. Despite needing him far more than he needed them, Friedrich Wilhelm treated Alexander as a junior partner within the coalition, maintaining that since the war had started as a conflict between Prussia and France, it was Prussia that should be calling the shots. Much older tensions between Prussia and Russia reignited in their shared areas of interest in Poland and Germany. For instance, Prussia was generally a little more lax with their Polish subjects than the Russians, who tolerated no dissent. Thus, the remaining embers of Polish nationalism that Russia had been so keen to douse had, in their minds, been kept kindled in Prussian-controlled Poland. Meanwhile, in Germany, Russia and Prussia were competitors in the scramble to assert their influence over the minor German states in the wake of the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. For as irksome as Sweden and Prussia were, nothing compared to the difficulties the Tsar faced in his dealings with the British. The alliance struck in 1806 between the two rival powers hinged upon Britain attacking the exposed flanks of the French Empire, while Russia, joining Prussia, engaged and destroyed the French armies directly. A fairly equitable deal that divided responsibilities evenly and according to capabilities. However, things began to unravel after Prussia's defeat at Jena. Prime Minister William Grenville, mired in controversy and having tried to avoid the war, was not seen as the man for the job. Grenville held out as long as he could, but eventually he, along with the Ministry of All the Talents, yielded to a resurgent war faction led by William Cavendish Bentinck, the Duke of Portland. Taking up the post of Prime Minister in March 1807, Lord Portland rallied hawkish Whig and Tory MPs behind a massively ramped-up subsidy program, as well as the promise of direct intervention into Germany by the British Army. After Napoleon's near defeat at the Battle of Eylau that February, Portland expected that renewed efforts would be enough to tip the scales in Alexander's favour. But rather than provide the assistance without caveats, Portland couldn't pass up the opportunity to squeeze the Tsar for some commercial concessions. With Britain's economy beginning to feel the effects of the continental system and war exhaustion, Portland was under pressure to see these demands through, his ambassadors to St. Petersburg hounding their Russian counterparts for a firm commitment. With Britain's antics fresh in mind, Alexander was receptive to pleas from his court and his advisors to make peace with France. Some in his inner circle, like Grand Duke Constantine, went a step further and proposed an outright alliance. There was much to recommend the proposal. France as an ally would immediately align Russia with a powerful new friend, end French meddling in Russia's wars with Persia and the Ottoman Empire, and secure a valuable trading partner now that Britain was demanding too much. That's not to say that things would be completely straightforward. French entanglements in the Balkans were a prickly issue, as was France's dominance in Germany and expansion into Eastern Europe. Thus an alliance was far from set in stone when Alexander sent his peace envoys to Napoleon, though he was leaning in that direction. As it happened, Napoleon was too. For similar reasons to Alexander, he saw little point in continuing to fight a power with whom he had no natural inclination to be hostile. As early as March 1807, Napoleon posited to Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice Talleyrand an alliance with Russia was desirable, if unlikely, given Alexander's misplaced fealty. Nonetheless, Napoleon was determined to pull out all the stops to woo the Tsar. The town of Tilsit, being as it was at the boundary between the French Empire's furthest eastern extent and the Russian Empire's furthest western extent, was perfect neutral ground. While Tilsit was dressed up to play host to hundreds of officers and dignitaries, engineers of the Imperial Guard artillery began construction of a floating raft. Atop the raft was constructed a pavilion, modest by imperial standards, but radiating symbolism. On the southern side, facing into Tilsit, the pavilion was adorned with the Napoleonic N. On the northern side, facing into Russia, was an A for Alexander. The gilded imperial eagles of France and Russia were mounted atop the pavilion's cone roof, arcing back to their respective capitals. This sightly exterior was not matched by the relatively sparse interior, consisting of only a single room modestly furnished. Just as with the exterior, the sparseness of the interior was to Napoleon's design. With only a few places to sit, he expected Alexander to forego his advisors, meaning the two emperors could speak man to man without undue influence. It took 3 days for the pavilion to be completed and then floated out into the exact middle of the gentle flowing river Niemen. In that time, Napoleon kept himself busy. Maintaining readiness in the army if things went pear-shaped was paramount, and so all efforts were made to position and provision the army corps for a renewed offensive. Morale had been heavily boosted by the victory at Friedland, and as ever Napoleon sought to capitalise on the propaganda value by publishing his report first for La Grande Armée and then for France. The Army Bulletin for June 22nd congratulated the troops on their mighty effort. Soldiers, on the 5th of June the Russian army attacked us in our cantonments. The enemy mistook the reason for our inactivity. They discovered too late that they attacked a slumbering lion. In the actions of Gutstadt, of Heilsberg, and in the ever-memorable Battle of Friedland, in a 10 days campaign, we have captured 120 guns and 7 flags, killed, wounded or captured 60,000 Russians, taken the enemy's magazines, ambulances and hospitals, captured the fortress of Königsberg, seized 300 ships that were in port laden with military supplies, and 160,000 muskets that England sent to arm our enemies. From the banks of the Vistula we have darted to those of the Niemen with the swiftness of an eagle. At Austerlitz you celebrated the anniversary of the coronation. This year you have worthily commemorated the Battle of Marengo. Frenchmen, you have been worthy of yourselves and of me. You will return to France covered in laurels, having secured a glorious peace containing guarantees for its permanence. The end must come, and our nation must be able to live quietly, freed from the malign influence of England. The rewards I will grant shall prove all of my gratitude and my affection for you. With the army in fine spirits, Napoleon turned his energies towards the final preparations for the summit. Preliminary meetings were held in Tilsit with foreign dignitaries, while a near-constant stream of correspondence connected the emperor back to Talleyrand back in Berlin, though the foreign minister was soon to pack his bags for Poland lest he miss out on all the fun. The gist of these letters was that Talleyrand wanted Prussia to be kept largely intact, since he was certain the Russians would not allow their ally to be destroyed. To make a punitive peace would be to sow the seeds of the next war. Napoleon was not deaf to these concerns, but was also certainly not in the mood to entertain the Prussians who, after all, were entirely at his mercy. Tsar Alexander remained the wildcard here, and with the summit rapidly approaching, Napoleon's instinct was to project strength whilst holding out distant hope for an alliance. As it happened, some loose talk from Prince Laban of Rostovsky hinted that this alliance was more likely than either Napoleon or Talleyrand could have hoped. Deep into the after-dinner brandies, the prince let slip details of the breaches in Russia's relationship with Britain. Perhaps Tsar Alexander might be willing to hear out an alliance proposal after all. The prince also shed some light on just what sort of ruler the Tsar really was. Napoleon had only ever known Alexander second-hand, through intermediaries and reports, never as a fellow monarch. He must have been aware of the rumours that Alexander was naive and eager to please, but here for the first time he got a sense of the man beneath the crown. Intelligent, considerate, amiable, all traits Napoleon found agreeable, and which primed him to see the Tsar in a far more positive light mere days before the summit. On the afternoon of June 24th, the Tsar and his entourage, escorted by the Imperial Guard of the Russian army, arrived on the northern bank of the Niemen. Napoleon sent his aide Claude de Roque ahead to make final arrangements for the summit, which was duly scheduled to start the next morning. As the hour of the summit drew nearer, soldiers from the Russian and French armies began to drift down to the water's edge, aware that they were witnessing a historic moment. Closest to where the raft was moored, the Imperial Guards of Russia and France were assembled at parade rest, forming a neat cordon behind which their respective retinues gathered. Always an early riser, Napoleon was the first to make the trip across the Niemen in a raft piloted by Marines of the Guard, the cheers of La Grande Armée spiriting them on their way. Accompanying the Emperor were his two diplomatic aides, Claude de Roque and Anne-Marie Savary, as well as his personal assistant Louis Bourrienne. Having arrived first, Napoleon had subtly asserted his primacy in negotiations. When a short while later Alexander's raft was on approach, the Tsar was already at a psychological disadvantage. But he swiftly turned that advantage on its head when, after dismounting his boat, Alexander's first words to Napoleon were, quote, "I hate the English as much as you do," to which Napoleon replied, quote, "If that is the case, then peace is already made." It was a promising opening that set the general tone for the rest of the summit. Leaving their entourages outside, Alexander and Napoleon entered the pavilion alone. They exited arm in arm 2 hours later. What exactly was discussed or in what detail is not known, as no notes were kept of the encounter, save for those both emperors recorded for posterity. Some specifics of policy must have been discussed at some point, but in the main, the true success of the 2-hour tete-a-tete was to put Napoleon and Alexander on the same page in terms of a lasting peace and a potential alliance. Writing to Josephine later that night, Napoleon remarked, quote, "I am very pleased with Alexander. He is handsome and an excellent emperor, and more intelligent than is presumed." Talks resumed the next day on the 26th, though this time with a twist. Alexander invited King Friedrich Wilhelm as his personal guest. Friedrich had spent the first 2 days huddled on the bank of the Niemen with the French army, watching his ally and enemy meet, expecting any minute to be called upon. When no call came, he returned to his decidedly unregal lodgings with a peasant family on the edge of Tilsit town, Napoleon having made damn sure all the best accommodations were reserved for himself, his officers, and the Russians. Despite being in an obviously hopeless situation, Friedrich seems to have believed until he stepped foot on the pavilion and shook hands with Napoleon, that Alexander and he, that Prussia and Russia, would form a united diplomatic front against France. That any juice Napoleon hoped to squeeze out of his victory would be resisted by Alexander. Instead, aboard the pavilion, he found to his horror Alexander and Napoleon talking as though they'd known each other for years. It did not occur to Friedrich, who was never all that politically gifted in the first place, that his presence at the summit was another of Napoleon's ploys, this time intended to allow Alexander to maintain an illusion of allegiance to Prussia. Friedrich therefore was not at Tilsit as a negotiator, a third ruler. He was set dressing to put Alexander at ease whilst Napoleon convinced him to cast Prussia aside. And without the firm guidance from formidable Queen Louise or the counsel of his hard-edged ministers, Friedrich was out of his depth. He quietly fumed, but outwardly, meekly accepted his last days as a great ruler without protest. Towards the end of the second day, Napoleon returned to Tilsit for an early dinner, and Alexander agreed to meet him there around 5 p.m. A 100-gun salute heralded the Russian emperor's arrival on the southern bank of the Niemen. On horseback, the Russian delegation trotted past the French Imperial Guard, standing at attention in 2 deep lines stretching from the shore all the way up to the town square. Not only did the townsfolk turn out to see this incredible scene, but so too did thousands of French soldiers who clambered up the side of buildings or rooftops to catch a glimpse. King Friedrich's entrance, a little while later, was heralded by less fanfare. The Prussian entourage was contemptuously ignored by the French, and when Friedrich arrived at the Tilsit town hall, the dinner had already started without him. It was an awkward and stilted affair. The conversation was pleasant but meaningless. It must have been agony for Napoleon. Every moment Friedrich spent drivelling on about uniforms, about the weather, was a moment Napoleon could have spent with Alexander, discussing the future of Europe. Unsurprisingly then, dinner was cut short and the three men bid their farewells. Napoleon returned to the apartments in town, Alexander not far behind. Frederick was bundled up against the cold and hastened away to his lodgings. And just like that, as though it were planned, and we might presume that it was, Napoleon and Alexander were free to meet in secret. This first night, as for most nights over the next 2 weeks, Alexander slipped into Napoleon's apartments by candlelight, and the two would talk until dawn. No servants or aides were present for these clandestine meetings, but some of what the two emperors discussed is known to us through Napoleon's memoirs and letters Alexander sent home to his sister, Anna. Every conceivable topic of interest to a ruler was covered. Politics, grand strategy, logistics, tactics, diplomacy, statecraft, language, art, culture, science, architecture, history, philosophy, you name it. A cadence quickly developed in which Napoleon answered more questions than he asked, and Alexander asked more questions than he answered. Despite this, Alexander more than held his own intellectually, oftentimes presenting a worldview that challenged Napoleon's. For instance, one evening the topic of government was debated. Alexander argued that the ideal form of government was at least semi-democratic, an elective monarchy in which people voted on who would take the crown. Unsurprisingly, Napoleon argued the exact opposite, that a strong ruler must know what is right by their subjects and designate an heir accordingly. Perhaps the question hit a little too close for home for Napoleon since the unsettled succession was a growing pain point. His answer is all the more fascinating because, at earlier points in his life and career, his answer to this question would have resembled Alexander's. Night after night, these sorts of discussions and debates flowed, quickly developing into a pleasant routine. It might be tempting then to call Napoleon and Alexander friends, but they were not. Friendship is not something common in the game of politics and statecraft. However, it would be wrong to claim that there was not a genuine and shared affection that bound the two men. So what was it? What do we call it? Their relationship was undeniably warm and intimate, quick too, looking like a very archetypal whirlwind romance. There was the imbalance of a mentor-mentee relationship, but one in which both learned from each other. One thing we can say for certain is that both men developed a genuine respect that soon affected official policy. After only their second night together, Napoleon ordered his Minister of the Interior, Joseph Fouché, to ensure both the French press and the French government portrayed Tsar Alexander in a positive light. Alexander reciprocated, ordering his own press to cease echoing British tabloids by calling Napoleon the Corsican ogre or merely Bonaparte. From now on, he was to be referred to by his imperial title or simply as Napoleon. This mingling of relationship and policy, which was soon to extend to the yet-to-be-finished treaty, certainly looked auspicious enough. But could it endure the inevitable challenges of two empires set on different courses, and two emperors so divergent in policy and ideology? For now at least, Napoleon and Alexander were on the same page. The same could not be said for King Frederick, though his opinion hardly factored in. At subsequent rounds of talks held aboard the floating pavilion, it was clear that Prussia's fate had been determined behind closed doors. Frederick didn't have the strength to change their minds, but perhaps Queen Louise, cunning and beguiling, just might. On July 6th, she entered Tilsit and requested an audience with Napoleon. Though her intentions were obvious and Napoleon was set on his aims, he did at least have to make an effort to appear open to compromise. Previous interactions between Louise and Napoleon, both through letter and in the press, had been hostile to say the least. Acting as though it had never happened, the Queen approached the Emperor with tact and charm. Unlike Frederick, who wanted Prussia undivided, Louise saw reason, arguing only that Magdeburg be permitted to stay part of the kingdom. The choice of Magdeburg was a wise one. Not only was it heavily fortified in defense of the westward approaches into Brandenburg, but Louis' family had strong dynastic ties to the region. However, for Napoleon, letting Prussia keep the city was out of the question. Magdeburg was his strategic key to Eastern Europe, linking La Grande Armée in Germany and Poland back through Berlin, to Magdeburg, then Frankfurt, and then to Paris. For 2 full hours, Louis had Napoleon's ear. He recalled, quote, "The Queen of Prussia has decided ability, a good education, and fine manners. It is she, and not Friedrich Wilhelm, who has reigned for 15 years. In spite of all my effort and skill, she retained command of our conversation, and always got back to her subject with perfect propriety and without antagonism. In truth, the matter was an important one for her, and time was short and precious. Quiet admiration aside, Napoleon refused to budge. The fate of Prussia was for him and Alexander to determine. An unexpected round two of their discussion came at dinner later that night. Frederick continued to babble on about decorations and designs for new uniforms. Alexander and Napoleon both pined to be alone together, while Queen Louise, trading tact for tenacity, dropped her regal mask to bare her fangs. At every opportunity, she made clear that Magdeburg must belong to Prussia. Napoleon politely tried to steer the conversation away, commenting on the gleaming pearls Louise wore. But riding roughshod over etiquette, she steered talk right back to Magdeburg, any faux pas be damned. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Unable to stand anymore, Frederick retired early, followed by Alexander, leaving Napoleon alone to be harangued by Louise. By his own account of the evening, as Napoleon reported to Josephine, he presented a rose to Louise in an attempt to stop her. She rebuffed the gesture, pulling her hand away and saying she would only accept if the rose came with Magdeburg. Napoleon retorted that it was he who gave the rose, not her. The implication was clear. Louise could only accept the terms Napoleon gave, not change them. After this, Napoleon had Louise escorted to her quarters by Duroc. Gallant though her attempt was, Louise was unable to preserve her kingdom. Prussia's fate was to be enacted the very next day, July 7th, as the Treaty of Tilsit was finalised. Napoleon and Alexander reconvened aboard the Pavilion, Prussians fully excluded from proceedings. The treaty's first clause began with the usual affirmations of faith and friendship. Both emperors made promises of peace and amity, explicitly aiming to restore a general peace in Europe, quote, upon immovable foundations. These foundations began, as ever, with revisions to European geography. Napoleon's intentions for Prussia had escalated since he'd last offered them peace in November of 1806, after occupying Berlin. At that stage, he'd been willing to keep Prussia whole, minus Westphalia, so that the kingdom might become an ally against Russia. Now, though, Napoleon was in near complete dominion of Germany, and had no need for an ally against his newfound friend in Russia. Therefore, the Kingdom of Prussia was to be reduced to its borders of 1772, the specifics of which were covered in Clause 12 of the treaty. We won't go over all the little details because we really would need a map and a microscope, but in the main, the River Elbe was to form an approximate demarcating line between French Germany and Prussian Germany. Everything west would go to France, everything east would stay Prussian. The grandest change this entailed was the ceding of the entire region of Westphalia to France, which, by Clause 19, was subsequently formed into a brand new state, the Kingdom of Westphalia, with its capital in Kassel. Though nominally independent, Westphalia was to be joined to the Confederation of the Rhine, and as per Clause 18, ruled by Jerome Bonaparte. Other little strips of territory along the Westphalian border with Holland and the Grand Duchy of Berg were also adjusted. As a concession to Alexander, Napoleon consented to non-interference in the internal affairs of the duchies of Oldenburg and Mecklenburg-Schwerin, which had strong dynastic ties to the Romanovs. He would not demand that they submit to France or join the Confederation of the Rhine, but he did maintain garrisons in case the British ever came knocking. For the Prussian heartland east of the Elbe, Napoleon had no territorial designs and wanted this region to remain the core of the kingdom, with only some exceptions. Danzig would be returned to Prussia, but as an independent city-state. Additionally, the few Prussian exclaves in Saxony were to be transferred to the Kingdom of Saxony. Not only did this transfer aggrandize Saxony, France's ally, but it also eroded the historically strong relationship between the Wettin of Saxony and the Hohenzollern of Prussia. The gifts to Saxony were not to end there. Since Prussia was to be reduced to its borders of 1772, its Polish territories were divided between Russia and the Duchy of Warsaw. Russia took land around Bialystok, while control of the duchy was transferred entirely to Friedrich August of Saxony, ending Napoleon's flirtations with the Polish nationalists. Not all was lost for the Poles, though. Stipulated in the treaty and agreed to by King August were guarantees of Poland's autonomy. They'd be permitted to retain their own laws, own institutions, and crucially, their own constitution. On top of that, Friedrich August was favourable to Poland's plight and willingly abided by their constitution. To close out the treaty, the last few clauses saw a normalisation of diplomatic relations with the exchange of envoys and diplomats. The limits of both empires were settled on their currently controlled or influenced territories, with neither ceding land nor influence to the other. Alexander also formally recognized the French Empire in its entirety, with Napoleon as its emperor. In exchange, Napoleon agreed to joint mediation in each other's wars. France would mediate a peace between Russia and their enemies in the Ottoman Empire and Persia. Russia would follow suit and mediate peace between France and Britain. All of these clauses and changes we've just covered are what made it into the final, public treaty. Omitted were the far more consequential secret clauses Alexander and Napoleon hashed out in their clandestine meetings, that were the true immovable foundations of European peace. Naturally, these secret clauses began with a military alliance. Notably, this alliance was not defensive only, being instead open-ended. Therefore, it was possible France and Russia could join in each other's ongoing wars. France fight with Russia against the Ottomans and Persia, Russia joined France against Britain. Though this sounded good on paper, it was not immediately advantageous for either Napoleon or Alexander to call each other to war. The fear of joint military cooperation was far more valuable than an actual intervention itself. So astutely both emperors opted to let the mediation to which they had both jointly agreed appear publicly to be the extent of their cooperation, whilst in secret defining clear terms for intervention in each other's wars should the need arise. In the ongoing Russo-Turkish and Russo-Persian wars, Napoleon rescinded his support for the Ottomans and Persians. He also committed to French mediation in which he would push for Russian annexation of the Ottoman Empire's European holdings, up to and including Istanbul. France would in turn be granted the Adriatic coast. If within 3 months the Ottomans had not yet agreed to these terms, France would intervene. To sweeten the deal, Napoleon also agreed to turn a blind eye to the prospective war Alexander planned against the Kingdom of Sweden, in which he intended to seize Finland. It cost Napoleon nothing to commit to neutrality should this war break out. Russia's involvement in the war with Britain was a little less cut and dry. Alexander haggled with Napoleon over the conditions under which Russia would intervene on France's side, the two coming to a beneficial arrangement. To begin, Russia would follow through on their promise to mediate a peace to the conflict. Though outwardly neutral, Alexander agreed to push for Napoleon's terms to be met. Specifically, that meant full freedom of navigation for all French or French-aligned shipping, a recognition of all territorial changes since 1805, and finally, a full and unambiguous recognition of the French Empire, its client states and dependencies. Britain had until November of 1807 to agree. If they did, Russia would support a British return to the continent, with Hanover exchanged in return for a full restoration of French, Dutch and Spanish colonies currently occupied by Britain. If afterwards Britain did not agree to these new terms by December, Russia would issue an ultimatum. If that ultimatum was then refused, Russia would join the war at France's side. You'll notice these terms were fairly similar to those offered to Russia in their war with the Ottomans. That said, Napoleon's war against Britain was a global affair and required stronger commitment from Russia. That meant inducing Russia to join the continental system. Without minutes or records from their secret meetings, it's impossible to say for sure, but if I were to guess, it was on this point that Alexander and Napoleon encountered the most friction. Though in principle Alexander agreed Britain's commercial dominance had to end, there was little practical advantage to be gained by Russia by actually following through and joining the continental system. To do so would be to deny themselves access to the international market for imports and exports, and though British goods flowing into Russian territory stifled native industry, the tariff and tax benefits proved far more lucrative in the short term. Russia's economy wasn't in the finest health to begin with, so saying no to easy money was something Alexander no doubt resisted. Napoleon's assurances that the French Empire could replace Britain as Russia's major trading partner and offer access to the European market had its appeal too, giving the Tsar a lot to consider. In the end, Alexander got to have a slice of both cakes. He would not immediately join the continental system as of July 1807. Rather, Russia would only join in the event of war. To make this deal palatable for Napoleon, Alexander agreed to exert pressure on Denmark, Sweden and Portugal to right away join the continental system. Austria was included in this list too, though it was something of an edge case. Austria was, on paper, an ally of both Russia and France. So should the two come asking for Austria to aid in the war with Britain and join the continental system, they were obligated to consent. Growing hostility to French aims and resentment with the terms of the Treaty of Schönbrunn made Austria's assent unlikely, however. So here Napoleon was glad to have Alexander's armies on standby to drive the point home should a truculent Austria get feisty. On balance, the finalised terms of the Treaty of Tilsit left both France and Russia stronger than they'd been when they'd entered. Rather than re-embark upon a destructive, expensive and aimless war, the two empires emerged from Tilsit as allies, with firm commitments to back each other in matters of vital strategic importance. None of this would have been possible without the personal relationship struck up between Napoleon and Alexander. It must have been a rather relaxing few weeks for the diplomats and statesmen, being left to write up the clauses in satisfactorily diplomatic language, rather than haggle and harumph. It was instead the emperors who lost sleep with their nightly meetings. It's not uncommon for big diplomatic undertakings to be influenced by affinities and aversions between members of negotiating parties. But I can't think of one that has been so clearly defined by a personal relationship as Tilsit. Alexander went into Tilsit at a disadvantage, expecting to need to bow down to a tyrant who had brought Europe to its knees. Instead, he found a refreshingly candid and respectful fellow monarch who was truly open to negotiation. Napoleon likewise was disabused of prior misconceptions. Alexander proved to be just as worthy an ally as he had an opponent, with much to offer France. Russia not joining the continental system straight away was a disappointment, but the commitment was enough. Beyond that, Napoleon could not have asked for things to go better. The terms were completely in line with his expectations. Perhaps, however, it's no surprise things went so well. The cordial atmosphere set from day one when Alexander voiced his disdain for Britain. The public and secret clauses of the Treaty of Tilsit were signed between Russia and France on July 7, 1807. 2 days later, the Prussians were invited along to ratify the treaty. Having been comprehensively excluded from deliberations, humiliated at every opportunity, left high and dry by the Russians, there was no mistaking Frederick's role as he entered the pavilion. He was there to sign the treaty, accept Prussia's dismemberment without a fuss, and go home. The treaty Frederick signed included all the clauses outlined in the public treaty from the 7th, namely the territorial changes and recognition of the French Empire. There were just a few additions. Prussia was to provide war reparations to France, cease all trade with Britain, and immediately join the continental system. To ensure these terms were met, the French would maintain their garrisons on Prussian territory at Prussian expense. In exchange, the Hohenzollerns would be permitted to retain a rump Prussian kingdom allied with France. Putting his signature to paper, Frederick committed himself and his kingdom to these humiliating and debilitating terms. Nothing left to do or say, he departed Tilsit for Königsberg without delay. Napoleon was not far behind. He wrapped up his 2 weeks with Alexander with a fond farewell. Alexander offered his best wishes to Napoleon and the imperial family, extending an open invitation for a visit to Russia. But Napoleon was not keen on the idea of spending another moment away from home. He'd already been away from France for nearly a full year and was aching to return. Napoleon departed Tilsit as the undisputed master of continental Europe and at the apex of his personal power and influence. La Grande Empire stretched from Normandy to the Niemen, from Spain to France, through Germany, Switzerland, Holland and Italy, and now deep into Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Reforms and innovations from the Code Napoleon to the Constitution of Year 10 to the continental system rested the Napoleonic Empire on solid institutional foundations. It's unsurprising then that when Napoleon was asked when in his career he had been closest to mounting the summit of his ambition, he chose this moment in July of 1807, when he was basking in the afterglow of the successful Treaty of Tilsit. Napoleon was posed this question on St. Helena, a wind-swept island outpost in the frigid South Atlantic, far from Tilsit, far from France, far from the action. We all know Napoleon's story ends in defeat and exile, and that story, of an empire collapsing, of a life's work unraveling, begins here. First comes the rise, then comes the fall.